James Parker lounged on the leather couch in his snug living room. A soft blanket draped over one hand and a glass of whiskey, with clinking ice cubes in the other. Outside, rain pattered softly against the windows, while the flickering glow of the television danced on the shiny coffee table. Normally, evenings like this brought him comfort, shared in the easy company of Charlotte. But tonight, an unusual stillness filled the house. The warm laughter that usually marked her presence was absent, replaced by a heavy silence. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 8:17 p.m. Charlotte was usually home by 6. Sure, her hours had become more unpredictable lately. Working for a large international company often meant late nights and overtime. Still, for the third evening in a row, she was running late. No text, no call. Don't overthink it, James told himself, pushing back the uneasy feeling stirring in his gut. He stood and headed to the kitchen to pour himself another drink. But the knot of suspicion tightened as he noticed her coffee cup still sitting on the table. The bright red smear of lipstick on the white porcelain caught his eye. He lingered on the imprint, recalling how Charlotte always touched up her makeup with such care before leaving. She was meticulous, always polished. Glass in hand, James wandered over to the window. The driveway was empty, her car still gone. With a sigh, he fished his phone out of his pocket, his thumb hovering over the screen. Should I text her? Call? The thought of what her response might reveal made him hesitate. Before he could decide, the low rumble of an engine broke the quiet, and headlights sliced through the darkness outside. He watched as Charlotte's car rolled smoothly into the garage. Moments later, the sharp slam of the car door and hurried footsteps on the driveway reached his ears. The front door creaked open, and she walked in, shaking off the rain as she hung her coat on the hook. "Hi," Charlotte said without sparing him a glance, her tone flat. James frowned, struggling to suppress his surprise. Her usual smile, her warmth, gone. Instead, she seemed off. Her hair was tousled, her lipstick slightly smudged, and there was a faint dark mark on her neck. The floral sweetness of her perfume was faintly overpowered by the unmistakable tang of men's cologne. "Long day?" he asked, forcing his voice to sound casual despite the tension bubbling beneath the surface. "Terrible," she replied curtly, heading for the stairs. "I need a shower." He stood frozen as she disappeared upstairs, his pulse pounding in his ears. The uncharacteristic hurry in her steps, the detached tone, and that strange, disheveled appearance. Everything about her felt off. The sound of water running upstairs pulled him from his thoughts. His eyes drifted to the small table near the entrance, where her bag lay. He hesitated. This isn't right, he told himself. But before he could stop, his fingers tugged at the partially open zipper. Inside, a small black box caught his eye, something he'd never seen before. His breath quickened as he pulled it out. A bottle of men's cologne. Closing his eyes, James took a slow, deliberate breath, but it did little to calm the storm of questions swirling in his head. Who was it for? Why? How long had this been happening? Each question struck like a relentless wave, threatening to drag him under. When Charlotte reappeared downstairs, now in a cozy sweater and jeans, she looked as if nothing was amiss. She curled up on the couch, crossing her legs with a casual smile. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice light but probing, as if sensing his unease. "No," James muttered, forcing himself to look away, though the weight of his thoughts refused to lift. In that instant, James realized this was just the beginning, the first of many questions he'd find himself needing to ask. And deep down, he knew the answers might alter everything they thought they had. That night, long after Charlotte had retreated to bed, James found himself lying awake, unable to drift off. The darkness around him felt heavier as his mind cycled through the past few months. The late nights at the office, those sudden business trips, and the scent, cologne. It wasn't the first time he'd caught a trace of it clinging to her clothes. At the time, he brushed it off as harmless, maybe a lingering scent from a coworker. But now it didn't seem so trivial. Another memory surfaced, her lipstick, smudged in a way that wasn't like her at all. Charlotte prided herself on her appearance, and details like that never escaped her. Little things, insignificant when viewed separately, had suddenly linked together like pieces of a troubling puzzle. James had never thought of himself as the jealous type. But now, as he watched his wife sleep soundly beside him, he wondered if he'd been blind to something that should have been obvious. The following morning unfolded in the usual blur of office life. The chaotic rhythm, phones ringing, papers shuffling, and coworkers rushing about, was familiar, even comforting for Charlotte. Amid the noise, her focus settled on Brandon Whitman, the department's newly appointed vice president. Brandon exuded confidence, always dressed in flawlessly tailored suits. He carried himself with an easy charm and that subtle accent that made every word sound smoother. Their paths had first crossed during a team meeting a few months back. When he introduced himself to the staff, Charlotte noticed immediately how effortlessly he stood out from the crowd. Even then, as she tried concentrating on the presentation, she caught his eyes lingering on her longer than anyone else. It wasn't much, just a fleeting glance, but it was enough to make her pause. That morning, Brandon appeared at her desk. "Got a minute?" he asked, resting his hand casually against the edge. Charlotte looked up from her laptop, quickly masking the slight flutter in her chest. "Sure," she replied, motioning for him to sit. He eased into the chair across from her, flashing a relaxed smile that hinted at quiet confidence. "I was thinking we could collaborate on some of the data for this new project," he said, his tone calm, like they were old friends, not just colleagues. They spent the next hour dissecting ideas, but beneath the surface, every word, every brief touch against the table, carried something unspoken. Brandon's eyes met hers more often than they should have, and his smiles lingered just a second too long. Charlotte felt her pulse quicken. In the days that followed, their conversations became routine. Lunches at the small cafes tucked away near the office started to feel like a habit neither wanted to break. Brandon listened with a kind of attentiveness that felt rare, and before she knew it, Charlotte found herself opening up to him, sharing things she hadn't talked about with James in years. Her hopes, disappointments, even the little frustrations. "You're incredible, Charlotte," Brandon said over coffee one afternoon, leaning just slightly closer. "I can see how much you care about your work. It's inspiring." His words slipped past her defenses like fresh air. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen, like someone truly noticed her. And that feeling, she wasn't ready to let it go. A month passed and their relationship shifted. Late evenings at the office brought them closer, physically and otherwise. Brandon always found a reason to brush her hand or lean in, just enough to blur the line between professionalism and something else entirely. One night, as they wrapped up, Brandon offered her a ride home. "You look exhausted," he said with a gentle smile. "Let me do at least one thing to help." Charlotte hesitated, but after a beat, she agreed. The drive was quiet, but the air between them felt thick. His cologne lingered, filling the small space of the car. When they arrived, Brandon stepped out to open the door for her. "Good night," he murmured, his voice softer as he leaned just close enough that she could feel his breath. "Thank you," she whispered, uncertain how else to respond. Her heart pounded as she slipped inside the house, the moment replaying in her head like an echo she couldn't shake. Later that night, with James fast asleep beside her, Charlotte lay staring at the ceiling. Brandon's face occupied her thoughts more than she was willing to admit. She had crossed a line somewhere along the way, and though she knew it, she couldn't stop herself. She needed to understand what these feelings meant. The next evening, after dinner, Charlotte sat down beside James, forcing herself to gather the courage she'd been avoiding. "James," she began, her voice quiet but firm, "I need to tell you something." He set his book aside, turning toward her with that familiar, patient expression. His eyes held nothing but concern and readiness to listen. "Of course. Is something bothering you?" James asked, his eyes narrowing slightly as he tried to read her expression. Charlotte swallowed hard, her gaze drifting away as if the words she needed were somewhere in the distance. "I've been thinking about this for a while," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. And I've come to realize, I think we need some space. James repeated the word, his brow furrowing. Space? What exactly do you mean by that? Her mouth felt dry, and she had to exhale before she could continue. There's someone at work. We've been spending a lot of time together. And her voice faltered. I think I need to figure out how I feel. Just for one weekend. Nothing more. James didn't move. He sat there, staring at her as if the air had been knocked out of his chest. You're asking me to be okay with you spending the weekend with another man? His voice was flat, cold, like someone speaking through gritted teeth. It's not like that, Charlotte rushed to explain. But James didn't let her finish. No, Charlotte. It's exactly like that, he interrupted, his tone sharper now. You're asking me to sign off on you cheating, and you expect me to say yes. Her eyes welled with tears as she met his gaze. I want to be honest with you. I don't want to lie or sneak around. Honest. James's voice cut through the room like glass shattering. The honest thing would have been not letting this start in the first place. He stood abruptly, towering over her. His expression was unreadable, but the weight of disappointment hung between them. No, Charlotte. I'm not giving you a pass for this. If you're going to do it, you'll do it without my approval. And if you go through with it, know there's no coming back. Without another word, James left the room, leaving her alone, trapped in the deafening silence of her own choices. Days later, Charlotte stood in front of the mirror in her hotel room, carefully adjusting her dress. The soft glow from the chandelier illuminated her face, highlighting the uncertainty reflected in her wide eyes. She dabbed a drop of perfume on her wrist, the same scent Brandon had once complimented. Her heart thudded harder than she anticipated. Was it excitement or something else? An uneasy feeling she couldn't shake? Downstairs, Brandon waited in the lobby. The two of them had booked a room at a luxury hotel downtown, far from the familiar streets and prying eyes. He had insisted on this, reassuring her it was for her own peace of mind. Charlotte appreciated the gesture, but something about how smoothly it all came together unsettled her. Like this wasn't his first time arranging such things. When she stepped into the lobby, Brandon rose to greet her. As always, he looked flawless. Expensive suit pressed to perfection, hair styled just right, and that signature smile that had first drawn her in. But tonight, something else lingered behind his eyes. Smugness, like he'd already won. You look stunning, he said, bowing his head slightly as he took her hand. His accent gave the words a polished charm. Thank you, Charlotte replied, masking the knot of discomfort curling in her stomach. They headed to the restaurant where Brandon took the lead, ordering the wine, selecting their dishes, and guiding the conversation with the ease of someone used to being in control. Charlotte noticed how much he talked about himself. Tales of his successes, his travels, his accomplishments poured out effortlessly, painting him as a man accustomed to admiration. At first, it was captivating, but the longer he spoke, the more a quiet irritation stirred within her. Not once did he ask about her job. He didn't inquire about her day, her thoughts, or her life. She sat across from him, feeling smaller with every passing moment, an invisible fixture at his table. By the time they returned to the room, Brandon poured her a glass of champagne, his satisfaction practically radiating from him. Relax, Charlotte, he whispered, stepping closer. You deserve this. Just you and me, no complications. No one has to know. She nodded faintly, but inside, everything screamed for her to stop. Brandon's arms slipped around her, pulling her in, and as his cologne filled her senses, something cold gripped her from within, sharp and unforgiving. This wasn't what she had imagined. Later that night, Charlotte lay wide awake while Brandon slept beside her, stretched across the bed like he owned it. She stared at the ceiling, her thoughts tangled in disappointment. The night had been ordinary, unremarkable. All the fantasies she had built up in her mind had crumbled against the reality of Brandon's vanity. His charm, his confidence, it was all surface level, nothing more. As Charlotte sat in the quiet of the hotel room, her thoughts drifted to James. She remembered the little things, How he always checked if she was comfortable. How he listened without judgment. The way his presence alone made her feel grounded. That warmth, which she had once taken for granted, now felt like a distant memory she longed to hold onto again. The realization struck her hard. She had risked their life together for what now seemed like nothing more than a fleeting fantasy. The following morning, Brandon suggested they unwind at the hotel spa, but Charlotte's mind was elsewhere. She responded to his questions with hollow nods and practiced smiles, though her thoughts wandered far from the room. Brandon appeared oblivious, lost in his own excitement and plans for the day. By the second evening, as they sat across from each other in the dim glow of the hotel restaurant, Charlotte couldn't hold back any longer. "Brandon," she began, swirling the last sip of wine in her glass, "why are you so sure this is the right thing to do?" He met her gaze with a confident smile. "Charlotte, life's too short to deny yourself pleasure. You know that. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here." His words stung more than she expected. While there was truth in them, the way he said it felt condescending. Like her presence wasn't the result of a lapse in judgment but simply the inevitable outcome of his charm. When the night ended, an overwhelming emptiness settled in. As Brandon spoke animatedly about something she could no longer focus on, Charlotte found herself staring at him, seeing him not as the alluring man she once thought he was, but as a hollow reflection of her own misplaced desires. By the time she slid into the driver's seat to head home, the drive felt unnaturally long. Her knuckles tightened around the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the road ahead, but her thoughts spun relentlessly between regret and fear. She had crossed a line she couldn't undo. Now, all that remained was returning to James, who, she feared, already knew the truth. James sat at the kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a ceramic mug filled with lukewarm coffee. The cup had been sitting there for over an hour, untouched except for the faint ripple on the surface from his restless movements. With a deep breath, he finally stood and moved to the living room, where the weight of silence pressed down like an unwelcome guest. Since Charlotte's return, the quiet between them had felt unbearable. She tried her best to act normal, to smile, to engage in conversation, but everything felt forced, transparent. Each word felt like glass shattering between them, and she knew James could see through the facade just as easily as she could. Dinner passed without a single meaningful exchange. The clinking of silverware was the only sound between them until Charlotte mustered the strength to speak. "James," she said softly, setting her fork down, "we can't keep going like this. We need to talk." His eyes lifted from the plate, cold and unreadable. "You need to talk?" he repeated, his voice carrying an edge she hadn't expected. "Fine. I've already spoken to a lawyer. I'm filing for divorce." Charlotte froze, her breath catching in her throat. It felt as if the ground beneath her shifted, leaving her grasping for something solid. You can't be serious," she whispered, her voice trembling. "James, it was a mistake. You can't just throw everything away." "Throw it away?" James's voice rose, though he kept his composure. "Charlotte, you're the one who did that. You made this choice. You broke everything we built." She tried to explain, her words fumbling over each other, growing weaker by the second. "It wasn't like that. I didn't mean for it to happen." James pushed his chair back and stood, glaring down at her with a heaviness in his expression that Charlotte had never seen before. "You want to know the worst part?" he said quietly, each word deliberate. "I still love you, and maybe that's what makes all of this so unbearable." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving her to sit in the cold emptiness he left behind. The fallout stretched into every corner of Charlotte's life. At work, the whispers had started, soft at first, but persistent enough that she noticed. Someone must have seen her and Brandon, and the rumors spread like wildfire. The same women who once greeted her with warm smiles now exchanged knowing glances as she passed by. Men she had barely spoken to suddenly looked at her with thinly veiled curiosity that left her uncomfortable. One morning, as she crossed the office floor, Charlotte caught snippets of a hushed conversation just before the voices fell silent. Two colleagues sat near the window, cutting their discussion short the moment they noticed her approach. Later that afternoon, she was summoned to her boss's office. The door clicked shut behind her, and he placed a few files on his desk before sitting down across from her. "Charlotte," he began, his tone calm but strained, "I'll be direct with you. Your work has always been excellent, but your personal life, it's becoming a distraction." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "If these rumors continue, I'm afraid they're going to affect your position here." Her heart sank. The walls she had built to compartmentalize her life were crumbling faster than she could repair them. Charlotte felt her stomach sink as the weight of her boss's words settled over her. It wasn't just her marriage unraveling. Her career, the life she had carefully pieced together, was beginning to crumble as well. When she returned home that evening, the next blow struck even harder. As she stepped into the living room, her eyes were drawn to the suitcases standing near the front door. Her breath hitched. What is this?" she asked, her voice fragile as she glanced over at James. He didn't flinch. "There for you," he replied calmly, though there was no mistaking the finality in his tone. "I thought it might be easier for you to start fresh somewhere else." Charlotte opened her mouth to protest, but the look in his eyes silenced her. "You made your choice, Charlotte," James said, his voice low but firm. "Now it's my turn. I can't live with someone I don't trust." Her legs gave out, and she sank onto the couch, tears clouding her vision as she tried to process what was happening. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words dissolved into nothing. For the first time, the full weight of what she had done pressed down on her, suffocating in its clarity. She was losing everything that had once mattered. Weeks later, Charlotte sat alone at the kitchen table in her small apartment, cradling a cup of tea between her hands. Rain streaked down the window, winding across the glass in delicate trails, as if mirroring the paths her life had taken. The silence was unbearable. Gone were the soft hums of morning conversations, the clinking of dishes from shared dinners, and the comforting presence of James. Now there was just the dull quiet of an empty room. She sipped her tea slowly, leaning back in her chair, but no matter how hard she tried, the memories still found their way in. That weekend with Brandon, the sense of excitement she had mistaken for self-discovery, felt hollow now. She had sacrificed everything for a fleeting thrill that meant nothing in the end. The sting of regret deepened when she learned that James had remarried. The news hadn't come directly. A mutual friend had mentioned it casually, perhaps not realizing the impact it would have. Charlotte smiled politely at the mention, but inside, she could feel herself unraveling. His new wife, Rachel, was described as kind, simple, genuine. Everything Charlotte had slowly drifted away from in the eyes of others. The first time she saw them together was in a photo one of her colleagues had briefly shared. James stood beside Rachel, holding her hand, with two small children by their side. They looked happy, effortlessly so. It wasn't posed or staged. It was real. Charlotte stared at the image far longer than she should have, until her eyes burned and she had to look away. The hardest moments came when she least expected them. Ordinary places filled with familiar routines. One afternoon, as she wandered the supermarket aisles, she caught a glimpse of a familiar figure near the produce section. Her heart jolted. James was there, pushing a cart, Rachel walking beside him, laughing at something he had said. Their son tugged at his sleeve, pointing excitedly to a box of cereal. They looked like a scene from a commercial, a picture of the life she had once imagined for herself. Charlotte froze, gripping the handle of her own cart tightly. She wanted to turn around, to disappear before they noticed her, but her feet wouldn't move. Then James turned. Their eyes met. His expression shifted, but there was no trace of anger, just a polite recognition, distant and hollow. He gave her a slight nod, the kind you offer to an acquaintance in passing, and then turned back to Rachel, wrapping his arm around her as they continued down the aisle. That brief moment sliced through Charlotte like a blade. Nights were the worst. Sleep eluded her, and the stillness of her apartment seemed to amplify every thought. Lying awake, Charlotte often found herself drifting back, remembering the early days at university when she and James first met. Their wedding, The plans they had made for the future, all the promises whispered in quiet moments. She recalled how he had lifted her up when she doubted herself, how he laughed at her jokes, how he once called her his muse. Now those memories haunted her like shadows, lingering in the corners of her empty home. She had built this loneliness with her own hands. Charlotte tried to move forward, but loneliness crept in like a draft through the cracks, chilling the parts of her she thought she had hardened. In an effort to make sense of the ache she carried, Charlotte began keeping a diary. Each page filled with reflections she had once been too afraid to confront. Regrets woven into every line, as if writing them down might somehow ease their weight. I thought I was searching for something new, but I already had everything I needed, she wrote one evening, the words lingering on the paper long after the ink had dried. When she wandered through the city streets, Charlotte often slipped into daydreams of what might have been. She pictured the life she could have lived if she had never stepped off course. In her mind's eye, she saw herself and James walking hand in hand, dropping their kids off at school. She imagined quiet family dinners, the kind where laughter softened the edges of the day. She even envisioned the small, silly arguments over forgotten errands or misplaced keys, the kind of trivial moments that made a life feel whole. Her fantasies painted a picture so real that, for a fleeting moment, she could almost reach out and touch it. But the sharp sting of reality always pulled her back. James had found happiness, genuine, undeniable happiness, with Rachel. She had seamlessly filled the space Charlotte left behind, stepping into the life Charlotte once believed belonged to her. It cut deep to see it, to know she had no one to blame but herself. And yet, beneath the ache, there was a quiet recognition. James deserved the peace he had found. One evening, on her walk home, Charlotte paused at the corner of a quiet street and tilted her head toward the night sky. The dark clouds that had lingered all day were beginning to break apart, revealing stars that glimmered through the gaps. She remembered the last thing James had said to her before he walked away. Every choice has a consequence. Now, standing beneath that endless sky, she understood the weight of those words. The lesson had come at a steep price, but it had left its mark, a mark she couldn't ignore. Charlotte realized that love wasn't just about fleeting emotions or grand gestures. It was about the choices people made every day, the choice to stay, to forgive, to hold on to each other even when it wasn't easy. Love was choosing to fight for what mattered, to nurture what was fragile instead of seeking something new. She had made her choice once, and it had led her here, alone but wiser. There was no undoing the past, no rewriting the moments she had lost. But as Charlotte stood there beneath the stars, she felt the faintest glimmer of hope take root. Perhaps she could rebuild, not for James, not for anyone else, but for herself.